Hello, welcome to Time Capsules. I'm Carl Qualls, Professor of History at Dickinson College. We've constructed this video series to illuminate some moments in European history. For my students, this series serves as a backdrop to our class discussions, but all viewers are welcome, and we hope that you too will enjoy unearthing the past. Nazis, fascists, communists. This is what many people think of when discussing interwar European politics. But why did so many European countries turn to more extreme politics? What effect did World War I and the mutilated peace have on this process? What about the Great Depression? Stick around for a short discussion of political polarization in interwar Europe, an era marked by the suspension of civil rights, violation of human rights, and murder on a massive scale. Wartime death and mutilation greatly reduced the number of potential workers. Moreover, mines and factories had been destroyed, and fields were crisscrossed by trenches and littered with bodies and machinery. Much of the potential economic vitality of the continent had been destroyed. Fear caused most countries to look inward to protect their own interests, rather than engaging with other nations. This retrenchment and isolation had dramatic political and economic consequences. In the economic consequences of the peace, the great economist John Maynard Keynes weighed in on the Versailles Treaty. If we aim at the impoverishment of Central Europe, vengeance, I dare say, will not limp. Nothing can then delay for very long the forces of reaction and the despairing convulsions of revolution, before which the horrors of the later German war will fade into nothing, and which will destroy, whoever is victor, the civilization and the progress of our generation. And he was right. In the Russian Empire, the collapse started during the war, as Russia experienced two revolutions. One, in February 1917, deposed the thousand-year monarchy. The second, in October, overthrew the provisional government and installed the first communist government in the world. One cannot underestimate the devastation of the war for these revolutions, but late imperial Russia was beset by myriad ethnic and class conflicts. Among the dozens of nationalities in the empire, many chafed at the Russian control and saw the war as an opportunity to break free. In the decades prior to the war, Russia had begun to industrialize quickly. The expansion of railways brought Russia into conflict with other major European powers in Central and East Asia, as well as Europe. And the emerging working class increasingly challenged royal authority, as during the 1905 revolution. All of these underlying tensions were exacerbated by a war that threw men into the trenches, often without shoes and operative weapons, to absorb the bullets of Germany and its allies. As we learned in an earlier video, Marxism and socialism more generally began to find resonance at the turn of the century. The social justice and equality promised by the Bolsheviks, however, turned to terror, violence, and chaos as Russia immediately entered into a civil war that pitted their new Red Army against monarchists and Imperial Russia's allies, including the United States and Great Britain. Russia then remained on a war footing from 1914 to 1922 and beyond. Russia was not alone. Other communist revolutions found purchase, in Germany and Hungary, for example. Both were very short-lived, about 9 months in Germany and 5 months in Hungary. But the influence lived on in that the fear of the Red Menace caused parties on the political right to begin to organize, because even in non-communist countries, socialist and communist parties continued to gain momentum. In countries like Italy and Germany, fringe political leaders like Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler started from socialist premises and then moved dramatically to the right to found two new ideologies, Fascism and Nazism. Italy ended World War I on the winning side, yet it had grievances that played no small part in the turn towards fascism. Like socialism, fascism offered a utopian solution to moral decay, national divisiveness, and poor quality of life. The state was to be at the center of all life and above the interests of class, party, gender, and other categories of identification. The state was to work for all Italians, and in return, all Italians were to work for the state. Fascism sought to undermine divisions between North and South, fulfill the quest for imperial territories, its inability to do so before World War I had caused frustration and humiliation, and end the perceived corruption, vacillation, and defeatism of older leaders. Italy had lost 700,000 of its 5.5 million soldiers, while doing little more than keeping the Austrian forces occupied. The war cost Italy $15 billion, which was much too much to bear for a poor country. Moreover, Italy got less than the Triple Entente had promised in 1915 to get Italy to leave the Triple Alliance. The Dalmatian coast territories, populated by Italians, were never handed over. Inflation, speculation, profiteering, and a glutted labor market from returning soldiers kept wages low. Workers took over 100 factories and seized the profits. Red Leagues broke up estates and forced landlords to reduce rents. When socialists captured 1/3 of the seats in the Chamber of Deputies in 1919, it appeared to threaten the business and property interests of the middle class. Industrialists and landlords sought protection of their assets by moving to the political right. Benito Mussolini was editor of Avanti, the leading socialist newspaper. However, Italy's initial neutrality in World War I led him to decry pacifism and advocate for entry into the war. The Fasci, or young, idealistic, nationalist, and white-collar Italians who started following him in late 1914, formed the basis of his movement. The movement's 1919 platform included standard socialist proposals like universal male suffrage, 8-hour working days, extensive capital levy, an increased tax on inheritance, confiscation of war profits, and opposition to all imperialism. 3 years later, on 28 October 1922, Mussolini organized 50,000 black shirts to march on Rome. His ascension to power came from organization, determination, and weakness of the ruling system. When the premier resigned, King Vittorio Emanuele III invited Mussolini to form a cabinet. This was not a coup or revolution. A parliamentary democracy allowed for Mussolini to be appointed. Over the next 3 years, Mussolini put his fascist system into place. In the simplest terms, Italian fascist doctrine consisted of statism. The state thus incorporated every interest and loyalty of its members. Nationalism. Nationhood is the highest form of society. Fascists believed internationalism was a perversion of human progress because each nation had its own character, which precluded harmony between distinct nations. And lastly, militarism. Strife was the origin of all things. Nations sought expansion to survive. War exalted and regenerated people, according to the fascists. Conceived in Italy, fascism spread to Eastern Europe and Iberia, and had significant followings in democracies, like in Great Britain, where Oswald Mosley and the British Union of Fascists caused great social and political disruptions. Fascists, like National Socialists in Germany, had their roots in socialism, but then shifted dramatically to embrace an ideology of inequality. Germany suffered terribly after World War I, perhaps more so than any other major European power. Not only did Germany have the same problems of dead and injured soldiers and ravaged territories, but Germany also had to deal with the punitive Versailles Treaty, which took its industrial areas, levied exorbitant remunerations, reduced its military to almost nothing, and most of all, cast the blame squarely on Germany for the war. This humiliating peace cast a long shadow over the 1920s. The new German government, known as Weimar, emerged from the 1918-1919 revolution and had a near impossible task of overcoming such losses. Many Germans immediately blamed the new government for having stabbed Germany in the back. The wartime press, military, and government had been telling its population that the war was nearly won. When the new socialist government was forced to sign the Armistice and Peace Treaty, many saw it as a socialist sellout of the nation. This created a steep uphill climb for the Weimar government. Moreover, the parliament was so fractured between left and right that little effective legislation was concluded. Despite all this, Weimar was able to reform the currency, tax system, and railroads, and laid a foundation for rebuilding the economy. The Great Depression of 1929, however, brought this to an end. In the 1932 elections, the National Socialist Party, or Nazi Party, became the largest party in Germany. It could not secure a majority, but President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor and asked him to form a new government. Politicians, industrialists, businessmen, and monarchists all backed the appointment in an effort to marginalize the political left. Within months, Hitler used emergency powers and began to bring the entire government under Nazi control. As in Italy, a right-wing dictator was handed the reins of power by a parliamentary democracy. Much like Italian fascism, the National Socialist Party started as socialists, as the party name suggests. Hitler's 25 points in 1920 included such socialist policies as nationalization of industry, division of profits, extension of old age welfare, and land reform. One can find the nationalist part of National Socialism in other provisions, such as unification of Greater Germany, that is Germany and Austria together, territorial expansion, and restricting citizenship to only members of the race, which included anti-Semitism and other exclusions that were very xenophobic. What do all these countries we have discussed share? All of them were relatively new to democracy. Russia was still planning for its first democracy when the Bolsheviks seized control. The Nazis benefited from the inabilities of the Weimar government to navigate Germany's many problems. Italy had been working under a parliamentary democracy since its unification in 1861, but the peninsula was beset by many cleavages, not the least of which were class and geography. In Germany and Italy, democracy, capitalism, and a degenerate modern culture seemed to be the problem. In Russia, democracy was stillborn, and capitalism had barely taken hold. Regardless, in all three, and many other countries beside, populations became disillusioned with their leaders, and their political and economic systems, and increasingly searched for radical solutions. These are only a few examples. In the 1930s, even more countries operated with governments that resembled fascism and National Socialism. Even where radical governments didn't come to power, politics polarized and radicalized throughout the interwar period. Desperate times in many people's minds called for desperate measures. A devastating war and then economic collapse caused many to question the democracies, monarchies, and capitalism that had led to the war. Isolation replaced cooperation. Fears and hatreds led to further conquests instead of compromises, as nationalism, militarism, and extreme ideologies brought on an even more devastating world war. Too often, people lump fascism, communism, and Nazism together. After we explore them in depth in class, you can decide, are all dictators the same? Or did they believe and act in different ways at different times? Just a hint. Historians dig for differences rather than trying to make grand generalizations like some other disciplines.